So first of all, a very, very warm welcome from the LSRI to this lecture by Penny Spikins, Building Back Kinder, how who we are affects how we rebuild. And I can't think of a more relevant title in the situation that we find ourselves in. But before I go introduce her properly and start speaking about her bio, I'm just going to give just a one or two housekeeping issues. First of all, there will be captions in showing while Penny is speaking, but if you don't want to turn them on, then turn them off in the More button, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you do have a question, please type in the Q&A, and also you will see live transcript as well if you need access to that. If you find yourself not able to come for the full session, or you want to go through this again, there will be a recording on YouTube for later viewing. But I'm really excited to have Penny with us today. We have known each other for a while, and we're working on a really, really interesting project together on the roots of gratitude, and another larger project on the motivation for our moral origins. Penny is a professor in the archaeology of human origins at the University of York. Her research has particularly focused on human, social, and emotional evolution, including the evolution of compassion, self-control, and egalitarianism, and the origins of healthcare and inclusion. Over the last 10 years, she has particularly focused on cognitive and social evolution, publishing papers on subjects including things like the evolution of compassion, the dynamics of egalitarianism, the origin of autism, attachments to objects, and Neanderthal childhood. Her recent interests focus on the evolution of human moral emotions, and our own project is part of that, and human emotional vulnerability, both of which are supported by the John Templeton Foundation, and some of which is another grant that she has herself, and some will be published in an open access book, which is going to be really exciting to read, and many of you may want to look at this shortly when it comes out, and it's called Hidden Depths, the Paleolithic Origins of Our Most Human Emotions, and I for one can't wait to read that. So the volume particularly focuses on the biological and evolutionary basis for compassion, tolerance, and emotional sensitivity, and how the evolution of these capacities can be traced in archaeological evidence. She's currently developing further research on the evolution of moral emotions, including motivations for tolerance, inclusion, courage, compassion, and gratitude, and their role in human self-domestication. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Penny now and just sort of welcome you again, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Over to you, Penny, on Building Back Kinder. Thank you.
Thank you, Celia. Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you here today. And as Celia's explained, we're doing some research together, and it's really nice to be able to talk about that research as well as some other things that I've been interested in. So I'm going to share my screen now while I go through my PowerPoint. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. So Building Back Kinder. I'm really interested in who we feel we are as humans and why that matters. And of course, I think it's been a particular focus in the pandemic over the whole of the last year. We've been really surprised, I think, by how willing everyone has been to constrain our freedoms and limit our lives to protect others. And we've also been surprised and very welcoming to see the extent that many people have been prepared to be stretching themselves out to help people in need at what is obviously a really difficult time. But at the same time, the whole pandemic has highlighted how vulnerable we actually are, and we're very uncomfortable with vulnerability. And yet at the same time, this last year, I think, has made perhaps everybody recognize the extent to which as humans we are quite vulnerable, certainly individually. Now, I'm interested in who we feel we are, what we feel it is to be human, and how that can sometimes influence what we do. Because I think it's important as we move forward that we understand those influences, and perhaps building back kinder might depend on feeling and thinking differently about who we are. It's a sad fact of human psychology and human evolved psychology that we tend to pay most attention to bad news. And there's a very good reason for that. And that's because in our evolutionary past, good news could come and go, but bad news and bad things might actually be out there to kill us. So lions or tigers, or we've evolved to be acutely aware of things that might go wrong because they might be the matters of life and death, and to take a little bit for granted the aspects of our lives which are perhaps kinder. And this skew has, I think, not only influenced who we think we are today and what we draw attention to, and if I think of some of the images of the pandemic, despite the many people who've gone out there to help others and all the constraints on our freedoms, I think it's images like the Capitol riot, the riots at the Capitol, that perhaps stay in our mind rather more than the images of the great extent of altruism that ordinary people, very humble people, have been carrying out. And actually, I think it's more important than this is the fact that we have an image of ourselves based on an idea of evolution, which tends to prioritize a sort of selfish, independent, and invulnerable ancestry. And I think the reason for that may be more to do with the skew of what we pay attention to than it is to do with who we actually are and who we have been and where we come from. Now, perhaps one of the best examples of this pattern comes from an individual called Raymond Dart. Raymond Dart, Raymond Dart was a very famous discoverer of the town child. The town child is a roughly 3 million year old hominin ancestor, and here he is holding it in his hands. It's a tiny, 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 very distant ancestor. He found the town child in a cave called Makapansgat Cave in South Africa, alongside broken gazelle bones. Now, Raymond Dart had had a difficult time during the First World War and been rather depressed, I think, by the state of humanity. And he'd also had a difficult time convincing anybody that his finds in Africa were important, whilst everyone in Europe were trying to find, believing in quite different supposed missing links. And when he saw the broken gazelle bones alongside his diminutive southern ape, as he called it, and he saw marks at the back of the skull of this ape, he came to the conclusion that this was signs of human conflict, that the gazelle bones were a particular type of culture, that people had basically bashed each other on their head with these gazelle bones, that the marks at the back of the head of this skull were all to do with human violence. And he came up with the conclusion that humans came from a uniquely violent past, that other apes were passive, but that humans were violent. Now, much of those ideas led on to films like 2001: A Space Odyssey, where you see, the apes discover, bones that they can use to hit each other with. And it's from that has come many ideas about an innately violent human past. But it wasn't that much later that we discovered that the holes at the back of this town child much better fitted the teeth of leopards. And the broken gazelle bones were highly characteristic of what you might find in a hyena den. So this was really an ancestor that had ended up as cat food and lived at a time when there were many hyenas and many other predators, and was a diminutive hominin ancestor that was basically prey and extremely vulnerable, but certainly not violent. So this is a really interesting story, I think, because he saw his beliefs about who we are very much colored what he found and the interpretations he made of it, but then led on to other ideas about violence that tended to spread because people tended to pay much more attention to those possibilities. So, what I'd like to argue today is that we are two things. We are much more compassionate and much kinder than we tend to think we are. We discount much of that evidence because it doesn't seem to us to be so significant to our evolved brains. But I think that we're also much more vulnerable than we like to think we are, and that this acknowledgement of human vulnerability may be important as we move forward because it may colour the types of societies we wish to plan. So to give you a chance to think about this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some reconstructions. They're very common reconstructions. There's nothing particularly uniquely misplaced or unusual about them. But I'm going to ask you to look at these three reconstructions and have a think. Now, we can talk about this at the end if you like, but basically I'll also go through this. What's missing or unusual? And these are by no means remarkable as reconstructions of a human past. So this is a reconstruction of the ancient human occupation of Britain at Heybra around 800,000 years ago. We have, perhaps unusually, because this is not a traditional, this is relatively recent, we have women, we have children. This is a reconstruction of modern humans like ourselves. It's just a popular one from the web. And this is a BBC reconstruction called The Incredible Human Journey. Now, if we were in a lecture room, I'd be asking you now, what's missing from these reconstructions? And in fact, what is pretty much always missing from all of our reconstructions, from our images of our ancient past? Well, certainly, I imagine that many of you would say there's not many women there, and they often seem to be at the back. They're often sitting down and they don't get to hold sharp stuff. And this is a very biased representation of our past. And I would agree with you there. There's a very common pattern. And really, any woman who didn't stand up would not really have left very many surviving offspring. So we know that women in the past were perfectly capable. They held sharp things and they stood up quite a lot of the time. And though they tend not to be represented. There also aren't many children. Roughly 50% of any group in a distant past is likely to be made up of children or adolescents, and they're very poorly represented. But it's not those aspects of what's missing that I particularly want to draw attention to. What's missing from almost all our reconstructions is that no one is vulnerable or dependent on others. Despite our skeletal record showing an abundance of serious illnesses and injuries, and I'm going to come on to that. When we look at our reconstructions, we never seem to imagine anyone in the past as anything but entirely independent and invulnerable. I think that's because we're very uncomfortable with what is, I think, our innate vulnerability. I think, and I'll come on to this, that the reason we're successful as a species is not because we're invulnerable, but because we know how to respond to vulnerability with kindness and integrate people. So actually, what's quite interesting about this is that Star Trek, many of my students will say she's brought in a sci-fi, a cult sci-fi reference already. If we look at the first generation of Star Trek and we look at the people who are represented there, we see a very, very similar pattern to those that we see in our reconstructions of the ancient past. And that's very interesting. So what we project onto our future is very much the same as what we project onto our past. Largely adult males who are invulnerable, peak physical fitness, occasional females who sit down and don't hold sharp stuff. But nobody is vulnerable. Nobody is elderly. There are very few children. Nobody's ill. And we're already facing, I think, as a society, the impact of COVID in terms of things like long COVID. If we look at the percentage of people who have disabilities, it's quite a high, we'd be saying, at least 10% of people we would say would have a disability of some kind. None of these are ever represented in our evolutionary past or our future thoughts. And I think that reflects a discomfort with vulnerability that I suspect we need to overcome in order to build better societies in the future. Is this image of society, Star Trek, the people on Star Trek, or the previous representations? Is this what we find in the archaeological record? Is there a basis for the idea that only the strong survived in the past and only the strong could, in our imagination, survive in the future? You'd be surprised by how different our archaeological record actually is from this characterization of the past. If we go back 1.6 million years ago, for example, this is an example of a Homo ergaster female from East Africa. Sadly, she died a long, slow death over many months from a condition called hypervitaminosis A. But what's interesting is that we can see this in her bones. She has an additional layer around the outside of this is her femur. But she must have been looked after, because this is a condition that would have led to loss of consciousness, extreme pain, and a complete inability to survive by oneself out in an African savanna. She must have been fed, brought water, and defended from predators for many weeks, potentially months. And this is something well beyond the care that we see in chimpanzees, for example, already at 1.6 million years ago. If we move forward in time to 500,000 years ago, we see a rather interesting pit at a site called Cima de los Huesos in northern Spain, the remains of several individuals out of a total of 28 who have various impairments and disabilities, yet have been looked after by their group. This is a child with craniosynthysis, which is a torsioning of the crania, who lived just as any other child until they died of other causes. But there was also an elderly man here who could hardly walk. He must have used a stick, and he must have been helped, and he must have been fed, and someone else who was deaf. So even 500,000 years ago, we already see records of several differences and disabilities within a relatively small group, we might infer, all of which are accommodated and included. 100,000 years ago, this is a child from a site called Kafsa in Israel with traumatic cranial damage, which led to reduced brain volume. They were not only cared for, but they were given a special burial with red deer antlers next to their skeleton. And perhaps the most famous of our ancient examples comes from a Neanderthal male, 60,000 years old, from Shanadar Cave in Iraq. He had a withered arm and leg. He was blind in one eye. He also only had one functioning arm, and the other arm was withered, and he was probably deaf. So that's some really severe impairments. These probably occurred at least 15 years before his death. So for at least 15 years, this man was looked after by a group of mobile hunting and gathering Neanderthals for whom this level of care can hardly have been easy. And rather past my period, because I do the Paleolithic, but interesting nonetheless, this is the Neolithic site of Man Bac in Vietnam. And here we find a man at what's called Burial 9 who's paraplegic. So he can barely just move his head very slightly. But he'd been cared for about a decade. So this is a really substantial investment. And you can see from the very, very narrow thinness of his bones, he will completely incapable of being supported on these bones. And yet he will have needed to have been turned daily and fed special food. This is someone who would have taken some really serious investment of care, even in modern times. And yet the rest of the group willingly looked after him. Why don't we hear about this record of our ancestral past? Why do we only seem to hear about violence and independence? To be honest, I'm not sure I know the answer to that. But I think part of that is that vulnerability and interdependence is something that we feel very uncomfortable about. And I would like us to feel better about that, because I think it's very important we recognize the fundamental vulnerability which we share and our fundamental compassionate response to vulnerability and why they've worked together to make us successful. Well, I said they work together, and I can almost imagine people saying, well, this is all very well, but surely looking after the ill and injury is just a nicety. And if times are tough, this would not be something that people would be doing. But the converse is in fact true. Why are humans compassionate? There are good evolutionary reasons why this should be the case. The first is a straightforward ecological evolutionary explanation, which is the same as we see from social canids in small groups where people begin collaborating to find their food, so hunting to find food. It only makes sense to share food, to share offspring care, and carry out all those things that are really important in our human evolutionary record. And when that happens, these are African wild dogs, we find extensive care amongst highly cohesive group members. So African wild dogs routinely look after their ill and injured. And this seems like a very nice thing for us to be doing, some morally correct thing, but they don't do this for some rational reasoning. It's to do with good evolutionary explanations, because each adult is crucial to the functioning of the group. So it only makes sense to have a motivation to care for every adult, come what may. Most will probably survive thanks to that care. Some may eventually die, but that motivation nonetheless is a beneficial one from a purely evolutionary perspective. And in fact, we can look at Neanderthals in Europe. Remember that Shanadar man that I told you about? And we can show how their level of care was probably an advantage to them. They were living in Europe at a lot of the time. They were living in Europe. It's very cold conditions, though not all the time. And they're living in northern latitudes where generally hunting and gathering is dependent on large game animals. These are groups that hunt bison, maybe even mammoth and woolly rhinoceros, these huge, huge animals that depend on a group working together to hunt, and that are very risky. There's going to be many injuries. This is likely to have only been possible by, like African wild dogs, though in a different and very human way, caring for those who are ill and injured. Only by providing that care would groups have been able to, very probably, occupy northern latitudes. But I think there's also an explanation more unique to humans, and that's around the influence of others' behavior on how we feel. When we see people responding to vulnerability, we ourselves feel more motivated to care for others. We feel more trusting and we feel more generous. So in a way that's perhaps unique, there's a ripple effect of human compassion. It influences others. So by there being compassion, seeing compassion and acting on it, we have a ripple effect of a kind of generosity, altruism, and compassion within society. And in fact, this may be, again, one of the reasons that we see this type of care in Neanderthals. So on the left, we've got the Neanderthal man that I talked to you about from Shanadar, and on the right, there's a man from La Chapelle-aux-Saints. So we've studied over 30 cases of probable care in Neanderthals, and many of these have been cases of care where it must have been abundantly evident Neanderthals had brains equally the same size as ours, that these individuals would never have survived. and that care was only really palliative care. This was only really caring to make them comfortable and because you fundamentally cared. So we have I've previously talked about the man from Shanadar, but the other example here is a Neanderthal from La Chapelle-aux-Saints who had some really severe systemic disease for about a year, will have been looked after despite being virtually incapable for all of that time. And I think this care is not just about the possibility that people will survive and the emotional motivation that comes from that possibility as a probability, if you like, but also because for any small scale human group to work together and to care about each other, everyone has to see that the vulnerable are cared for. It influences everything and everyone in a more profoundly human way. So for me, therefore, there's been two stages in the development of human compassion, or rather human vulnerability and its response. A stage which makes us the same as nature, a stage that, despite quite a marked compassionate response, is something that connects us to other animals, and one that's probably a little more unique to humans. Well, why does this matter? I think it matters because I suggest we're more compassionate than we imagine that we are. And this matters because if we see around us an uncaring world, then we ourselves close up and think to survive, we must too be selfish and uncaring and think only about ourselves. So that whole message is, I think, an important one. Also because we have been both sensitive and vulnerable for millions of years, and that's not the image that we have of our evolutionary past. And this also matters because we cannot plan for a future in which we imagine people to be individual and independent, because this is going against our very nature as vulnerable beings. And we see something of this vulnerability as well in our archaeological record. We see, for example, elaborate responses to death. This is a Neanderthal infant burial from Dederia Cave in Syria. And here we can see that this Neanderthal infant was buried with a heart-shaped, you might not be able to see it, so if you can show you with this, a heart-shaped flake over their heart and a stone above their head. We get a tremendous sense that this was very much an infant who was cared for. We see a sensitivity to animals around us that goes beyond seeing them as prey. This is a biface made on an elephant bone. This is 300,000 years ago, but there are examples that go back 1.5 million years. And these are not very functional things. If we want to make a hand axe, we should make it from flint. But to make these tools out of elephant bones, which don't really then perform a function, suggests some more symbolic or some sense of attachment that talks to us about a sensitivity to animals around us, particularly, I think, elephants, who we know to be highly empathetic beings. This is another rather nice example. This is the remains of a dog, which is roughly 14,000 years ago at a site called Bonn Oberkassel in Germany. This dog was buried with 2 adults, but what was interesting was the dog died at about 27 to 28 weeks old, but having suffered very severely from canine distemper for at least probably around about 15 weeks at least. So it would have been very unlikely to have survived if its presumable owners had not cared for it very carefully for all of that time. So we associate that with a strong bond between people and dogs, a sensitivity and a response to vulnerability that goes back this far. I talked about vulnerability. And there's an important point to make here that I suspect we also maybe need to take on board. This is some of the most famous cave art. These are the lions from Chauvet Cave. They're really remarkable. But to draw this accurately and this well demands incredible practice. We estimate hours and hours of practice, perhaps even every day, to come to the level of skill that we see in the apparently very easy drawings of much of this kind of cave art from the Ice Age. This is talent, this is sensitivity to the animal world, but this is something else as well, a vulnerability that comes from caring what other people think about you, wanting to be appreciated. And it's that vulnerability that I also think we need to take on board, because that's a vulnerability that tells us about and easily being influenced, easily being forming part of a herd because we find it difficult to be alone, easily, sometimes easily led. So we're vulnerable in not just the physical, we're vulnerable emotionally as well. And that emotional vulnerability sometimes makes us desperate to kind of achieve or display some kind of something that we have to be valued. And to be valued is good in many ways, but sometimes it can have a more darker side of that vulnerability. So I'm going to finish with a picture of a puppy, and you're going to say, oh, really, do you need to finish with a picture of a puppy? Well, actually, I do. There's a good evolutionary reason why I'd like to finish with a picture of a puppy. Not just because there's been a whole escalation of people having puppies in lockdown, which is both a sign of our vulnerability, but also in some ways potentially a little problematic for some of these dogs that might suffer if we return to work. But more than this, we found that human skull shapes have changed in ways over the last 200,000 years, which allow us to to move our eyebrows in the areas above our eye to express vulnerability. Dogs, as they've interacted with us since they've been wolves, have done the same thing. So dogs that can make this expression of vulnerability, as we see here, are more likely to be rescued from shelters. And we also have evolved to be able to express vulnerability. It's really just a sign of how fragile we are and the significance of vulnerability, its expression, and others' response to it in our evolutionary past. So, looking forwards, we don't like to think of ourselves as vulnerable, but perhaps we should try. Because what set in train everything that made human communities successful in our distant past, able to live in certain environments, able to live by hunting, able to share food, able to share infant care, is vulnerability and its response in compassion. And so perhaps I would suggest to you that it's time to think of ourselves rather differently, to overcome our tendencies to look and pay attention to the violence, and to consider again where we've come from and our vulnerability and compassion that comes from that. Thank you.
Fantastic talk, and really giving us a taste of how deep vulnerability and compassion goes in our evolutionary story. While people are thinking about their own questions and developing those, I'm just going to ask one myself. I mean, as a theologian, the issue of vulnerability and compassion is built into the way theologians often think, especially when they think about the vulnerability of Christ on the cross. In other words, having a God that is also crucified and vulnerable and tortured and dies is itself kind of remarkable in one sense. So it's a different, sometimes it's seen as a different kind of model of who we are as human. But what you're saying really is that actually it syncs with our evolutionary past to think like that, and maybe our economics, which is often about selfishness, or we always act in relation to self-interest or something like that, is portrayed as the basis of who we are as humans. So how do you think that some of these ideas might be helpful without necessarily saying that we have to just read off from the natural world what you might call lessons for a different society. So you mentioned how we build back kinder, but do you think there are limits to doing that? So there's this complex question of both the biological basis for the evolution of compassion and response to vulnerability, but also the cultural basis. So perhaps we're now in a position to think about how do we think about reforming or changing those cultures. So do you have anything to say on that, and whether there are, if you like, limits in those expressions of compassion, who they were directed to? Was it towards family members, wider groups? You mentioned dogs, etc. So it seems almost like a kind of non-rational, if you want to put it like that, basis. So it's based much more on our deep emotions. So could you just explain the contrast, perhaps?
Exactly, yeah. I think there's some really important points in there. I think it would be, I am interested in our deep emotional reactions, but I'm interested in them because I also think that our cultures affect those quite fundamentally. If we feel safe and we feel that people around us, there's very much a feeling that people around us are kind and compassionate and will respond to our vulnerability, then we feel more giving ourselves. And there's at least some evidence that what we actually see, or rather it would be naive to just say, because we all know this isn't true, people are so fundamentally compassionate that we are compassionate all of the time. That's clearly not true. We clearly are capable of tremendous cruelty as well as compassion. But at the same time, I think that interaction between what I think is a fairly deep-seated emotional response, we certainly find, for example, in infancy, that we are first compassionate towards people and then develop a top-down rationalizing based on our culture. So I think that acknowledging that deep-seated nature is quite important. But we also have to acknowledge that from an evolutionary perspective, there are almost different modes of being. Like there have been times in the past where perhaps at times of extraordinary famine or who knows what, it made sense for people to be entirely self-centered. And there is different options to the way in which we can be. We have sort of different physiological options in the way in which we react to the world. So it's not that our nature of being is such that it can overcome everything around us. It's more that the right cultures promote the right physiology that's there to begin with, but in the wrong cultural context can be completely repressed around some belief and even fear. So we might both believe that everyone is individualistic and at the same time feel afraid, and the two together creates a particular sort of dynamic. And I suspect that, I certainly don't have all the answers at all, but I just think that our sense that we've evolved to be something highly independent, individualistic and selfish is part of a damaging part of that cultural narrative. It's only one part, but it's a part that I'd like to address in some way.
Thank you, Penny. We've got a few questions coming in now. So, what the first one is this: doesn't all this fit with the idea that a good society looks after the vulnerable?
Yes, it does really, because I think the two levels are really important there. Because one level is, yes, from an economic perspective, because they may be vulnerable now, but then if you're just going to be purely economic, you can't predict who's still going to stay vulnerable. You just are, accommodating of the vulnerable and responding to them from a purely economic perspective. But taking that aside, yes, because if we don't look after the vulnerable, that affects us as an entire society and culture. It affects us physiologically to be aware of that. So I think those two levels work in terms of a need to look after the vulnerable, because to not do so is sort of going against something that is fundamental to ourselves.
So another question now come in. What do you think of accounts that do stipulate violence in the relationship to order as being a central element of history, whether on an anthropological level, such as Girard's account of the sacred and the coming together of the social, or perhaps even religious, such as the biblical account of human life post-Eden? Why might we need to construct these narratives contra what you're suggesting is the evolutionary record?
Well, I think that's very true, that evolutionary record. We don't get any good evidence for sort of intergroup violence until about 10,000 years ago. So that's very late, actually. But nonetheless, in the sort of historical record, there's plenty of evidence for violence, and there is plenty of evidence for violence throughout our archaeological record, at least post 10,000, in terms of intergroup violence. But there's also sort of very large areas of peace, which suggests that there's a dynamic there. And perhaps it's important when we have narratives about how we can become violent, it's very important that we understand those processes as well. We understand how can it be that a society can be functioning and collaborative and cohesive, and yet at another moment starts to fall into high levels of competitiveness and not caring for the vulnerable. That there is a balance there that perhaps we need to understand.
Yeah, and I think that sort of dynamics or recognition of both at the same time, if you like, rebalancing perhaps what's been distorted. And in a sense, this connects with another question about economics. So in economics, the importance of care work in the economy was emphasized by the feminist economics movement. Is the fact that vulnerability and care has been neglected in archaeology because the discipline was too male dominated?
I like that question. Actually, I think it's not so much archaeology isn't too male dominated, but human origins part of archaeology is very male dominated. So there are certainly whole areas of that record that are under researched, I think. And I don't think it's necessarily that the discipline has felt that it wasn't important. It's just that people have felt too vulnerable by studying them. That is not, that those areas of study would make you vulnerable just by associating with vulnerability in some way. So I can imagine that's probably true. But I do think that actually it's not just archaeology, as you say, across disciplines. I mean, there's been very much a kind of rational, independent, self-orientated model of a very traditional economics, which has changed a lot. And I'm not an economist, but I just know from friends who are, which has obviously changed hugely over the past few decades towards a better understanding of the role of care and towards a better understanding of how people behave emotionally in relation to things rather than purely rationally or selfishly.
So was care and compassion gender specific?
Oh dear me. I don't. That's really tricky. Personally, I look at some modern hunting and gathering societies like the Baka, who aren't really making male-female distinctions, and care is quite distributed. So infants, for example, are spending equal amounts of time in the arms of males and females. And so it's not necessarily so. But does that mean that sometimes it's more, there are more females caring than there are males? Potentially, that's true. It's not a necessary case, though. We know that certainly.
Yes, and someone else has also said, I'm aware that bullies, both child and adult, can be readily compassionate under different circumstances. And when did the culture of bullying develop?
I would guess it's always a possibility, but that controlling or limiting bullying depends on our capacity to sort of courageously confront it. And there's quite a lot of evolutionary evidence, or rather evolutionary modeling, that shows that you can't really just have altruism by itself, because you just end up with a fair amount of exploitation. You only need one person who starts bullying everybody else. That you have to be both altruistic and prepared to stand for principles. And so I imagine that there's always been a case. I mean, children who there've always been different levels of attachment, presumably. We tend to find modern hunter-gathering societies have high levels of secure attachment, but there's still some individuals, who maybe, often it's the case where there's orphans in these societies, who become more insecure. And so, you're still going to have some insecure individuals, and it's insecurity that often breeds bullying behavior, isn't it?
Yes, and those who've actually said who they are in the questions, I think I'll start saying who they are in case they'd like me to say who the question's from. Chris Ives has said, what do you think is the origin of our current personal and societal discomfort with vulnerability do we need to understand this in order to recast perceptions of weakness and care and compassion?
Do you know, I'm not sure that I know fully what the origins is of our discomfort with vulnerability. I think it comes in sort of neoliberal ethics, the idea of sort of very individualistic societies. And when we say we, there are probably other cultures that are more comfortable with vulnerability. I'm reminded of some research which is saying that, there's a Japanese word amai, which means a kind of sweet dependence on others, and we don't have that word in English. And I'm not to say that Japanese society is much better at vulnerability. I'm just using an example of how different societies may have ways of discussing vulnerability or feeling vulnerability as not necessarily as negative. But I'm not really, so I don't really know necessarily where that's come from. I think that's a very complex question. I'd love to know the answer to that. But I do think it's something that we have to engage with as we move forward, because surely we've all felt vulnerable this last year. There cannot be any of us who've not worried about getting COVID, or if we've got COVID, have worried about what that might mean, or had relatives who've been affected. We must all have been affected. And I would like us to take something positive from that in appreciating our vulnerability when we move forward.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. So Father Frank Turner is from Campion Hall has also asked this one, going back to political philosophy such as that as Thomas Hobbes, born in 1588, a violent time, and he argued that we need a strong and even repressive government, otherwise human life is nasty, brutish and short. And in economic policy, care work is very poorly paid. So lip service, but no real reward. So I don't know if you've got any comments on that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think you're right. I mean, we do talk about sort of contrasting the sort of Hobbesian idea of what human nature is like as sort of life is naturally nasty, brutish and short if you don't have some very strong governing influence to limit that, with other perspectives on which, we have a sort of innate capacity to be kind and caring, but that doesn't necessarily flourish depending on the context. I absolutely agree. Care work is really poorly paid, and sometimes I think it's a shame that people who want to do something worthy and want to respond to vulnerability almost have to pay a price for that, by accepting a pay that's lower than some other option they might have taken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's such a relevant point, really, isn't it? We see it in care homes and all sorts. So, how going forward do we cultivate this appreciation and acknowledgement of our innate compassion? Is it, and this is an interesting question too, is it purely individual matter, or are there changes needed on a societal level?
That's a very good question. I think that we need structural changes, because I don't think we can say to people, I find that, however important we think compassion might be, we can't go around saying to people, you should be more compassionate, because what's the reason by which they don't feel compassionate? Something has happened, some structure is there, they don't feel safe, they feel afraid, they feel insecure, they feel vulnerable, they feel, that other people won't be there for them. And only structural changes that make people genuinely less vulnerable, or not vulnerable is the wrong word, generally less scared and genuinely safer, could really allow that kind of compassion to flourish, I think.
And what from John Bergman, who's at Regis College, what would be your account of how order and cooperation is based prior to the time 10,000 years ago, when intra-group violence or coercion arises? Is there a lack of even a sense of self as a basis for self-interest?
That's really interesting. I think I think that what happens is, and something that Celia alluded to a little, that for a lot of our evolutionary past, we probably lived in small, highly collaborative groups that didn't necessarily engage with other groups in the way that we might see in other animals. They're not necessarily in any way aggressive towards other groups. And certainly, in terms of survival, there's got to be some kind of mating network. But it's only after a little bit earlier than 110,000 years ago. It's only after around about 200,000 years ago that we see the first reasonable evidence of materials moving between what we think might be different communities. So it's relatively late, I think, that you see sort of peaceful connections. And it doesn't mean that they were aggressive before. I don't think they were. I think there just wasn't much connections. I think much like we might see in wolves or canids or whatever, you've got still intelligent humans, but they just probably were scared of strangers. That's not to say they were aggressive towards strangers, but I doubt they sought them out. And then you start to see changes where people are able to collaborate across groups, and that's quite a big difference. Sense of self, I should imagine there is still some sense of self. We're starting to see some evidence for kind of art that probably indicates some sense of self.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating, isn't it, that art is found in Neanderthal societies as well now, in a way that no one really suspected a long time ago. So our sort of image as well of some of the early hominins as not having any kind of sense of subjectivity might need to be challenged. But Dermot Lane has come up with another good question, and he thanks you for the fantastic lecture. Of course, I agree.
Thank you.
How does your thesis square with the view that we are the outcome of a competitive process, or more recently, are the outcome of both competition and collaboration?
Yep, thanks for that. Well, I think we have to take into the account the issue of scales, because this is still about evolutionary processes. This is still about those behaviors and the motivations for behaviors which provide the best probabilities of your offspring surviving to reproduce are the ones that get selected for. And that's still, in a sense, competitive. There's still some individuals will survive and others won't, but it's that competitiveness can play out by reciprocal interactions and by generosity, in the same way that we see that in other animals. And the same with African wild dogs, it has paid off to respond to the vulnerable, ill and injured for them. And in very similar ways, I suspect, for early hominins, the same thing was happening. But there was still the same evolutionary process occurring. It's just that they can, in certain circumstances, create motivations, compassionate motivations and generous motivations, at the same time as being on the big scale all about what works and what doesn't work.
So just a chance for just one or two more, because we'll close off in about 5 minutes or so, because you've done amazingly well asking all these questions. Thank you so much for your
thank you for all the questions. I'm so glad everyone enjoyed it.
So one from David Williams. What would you say about the development of psychopathic personalities who appear to lack any concept of compassion or awareness of others?
That's a really tricky question. It's something I was talking about with some colleagues only a few days ago, in fact. It's a difficult one. I don't know if when we look back in hunting and gathering societies, we can see that by and large, people who are consistently dominating or selfish, who we would probably therefore today say had psychopathic tendencies, tend to be excluded from groups. So they don't have the opportunity to reproduce because they're thrown out or even assassinated. But so there will be a whole sequence in which they're ridiculed, what have you. But in egalitarian societies, you tend to see that people who are fundamentally really only self-interested and really quite bullying won't get an opportunity to reproduce. And so, you know, we look at sort of the genetics of psychopaths, and they're very, very low levels. And on the one hand, you might say, well, isn't it terrible that, you know, you've got people with psychopathic traits and there's some element of genetic association with that. On the other hand, you think, well, you know, look at 99 point however many percent of us that don't have that. And that's a result of the fact that it wasn't successful to be a psychopath. But it still doesn't, that doesn't get away from the issues. I don't know if you've seen, there's some really wonderful talks by James Fallon, who is a neuroscientist who discovered that his brain matched that of a psychopath. And he says he probably does fit many of those traits, but he's channeling that towards a social good. So, you know, he advises the CIA and all sorts of things. I think that's an interesting example of where social norms and cultural norms and what people value can influence what someone, even who would claim to be a psychopath, can become.
Yeah, that's it's so difficult, isn't it, working out where those tendencies come from. Here's, I think we have time for one more. Does the colonial history narrative still influence us? The idea of a noble savage as opposed to the desire to conquer, resulting in violence from both sides, still hangs over us.
Oh, that's a really interesting
the playing
question.
down of compassion by so many.
Yeah.
So what do you make of that?
I'm just going to go back for 1 second, because the point you just said there, it's about the psychopaths, because what we know is that people can inherit the genes that would predispose them to becoming a psychopath as an adult, but in the right environment, those won't necessarily be expressed. So you'd still get sort of someone who is functioning fairly normally as an adult, but in the wrong environment, you get a sort of overemphasis of those genes. I think I should just go back and say that, because it's not as if you inherit some genes, you become a psychopath. It's much more complicated than that, but there still are some genes that might predispose you in the wrong environment. That's a very good argument for trying to keep down, you know, violence and violent societies and war, because, you know, that's just going to make that difference. But just on to the colonial history narrative. Oh, I'm sure it does. I think certainly Human Origins has really suffered from that colonial narrative, and the whole message of, you know, there were sort of better sets of hominins that were better than other hominins. And, you know, we tend to imagine that, don't we, as this sort of progression of forms. I mean, they're all men again, but progression of forms in which, you know, we think of the individual mind, and we think that evolution has produced this one wonderful, perfect mind from these processes. And it really isn't the case. And I think you're right. The colonial history narrative influences our whole attitudes to how we came to be who we are today, with that idea of a perfecting person, which isn't really how things have worked.
I'm just going to give this one sort of comment, really, more than a question, but whether you respond to it or not, Penny, is your call. But I think it's quite interesting, and it's this, from an anonymous person. I wonder how much a strong sense of security is really needed for showing compassion. For in our contemporary society, it seems that many of those who are most secure, like the very wealthy, are not typically understood as those to be who are most compassionate. On the other hand, many who are very vulnerable seem to be particularly compassionate. I thought that was...
Yeah, no, that's a very, very important point. And I think I probably need to be clear what I mean by secure. I mean sort of emotional security that you get through attachment to people who've been caring for you in childhoods. I think you're absolutely right. There is some research showing that working class people often have more empathy because they're in an environment in which interdependence is really important, and there's a real emphasis on interdependence. And so that despite all the odds, that it's very much, you know, empathy is so important that it becomes sort of more stressed. But I think there's different types of security. So there's the secure in terms of bad things aren't going to happen to you, which is one type of security. And there's the emotionally secure, which is you've grown up in an environment in which you're very aware you're loved and cared for, which is sort of very much independent of kind of economic situation. Although it is still true that if you're living in a deprived area, it's very hard to create that security, because you may just not have enough time to be with your children, no matter how nice you are. There may be that many pressures. So there is an element of deprivation that perhaps comes in.
Right. Well, thank you for that marathon question.
It just shows,
and there are more coming in, and I'm very sorry to all of those of you who wanted to ask a question and couldn't. But I think it sort of displays, to me at least, how how vibrant a webinar like this can be. And sometimes it's easier because we don't have to make ourselves vulnerable by being anonymous, so we can ask any kind of question we want and no one knows who it is.
Well, it's been wonderful. It's been wonderful to have all these questions. I'm so glad everyone enjoyed it so much, and so many things you've made me think about to go away with.
Yeah, so it is, what I'm saying is it kind of proved the point you're making. So thank you so much, Penny. And I think we'll close off now and just say, thank you for your time, energy, and really fascinating topic. And we will look forward to hearing it again, I'm sure, at some other stage. So thank you. And thank you, everybody, for coming and your support.
Thank you.